For 35 years, no one knew what had happened to Reverend Isaiah Coleman, a black preacher who vanished one summer evening in 1980. No note, no witness, no grave. Most stopped asking. Some said he ran. Others whispered that he had seen too much. And then, decades later, an old bloodhound named Copper scratched at the roots of a dying tree. What he uncovered would reopen everything. Before we begin, if stories like this speak to something in you, consider subscribing to the channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next story. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. We always hope these stories find their way to the right ears. Now, let us return to Mississippi in the year 2015 to follow the very first trace of what was once lost. The morning light over Willow Creek was soft and pale, the kind of light that filtered gently through the trees without making promises. The pines stood still. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet you only got deep in the South when nothing had happened yet. Henry Wallace, 72 years old and no longer quick on his feet, walked the edge of the clearing behind his property, a thermos in one hand and a whistle tucked in the other. His dog, a lean brown coonhound named Copper, zigzagged through the underbrush ahead of him. The dog had caught a scent, maybe a squirrel or raccoon, maybe something else. Henry had seen that body language before. He didn't rush him. The sun hadn't fully risen above the tree line when Copper let out a sharp bark, then started to dig. Henry paused mid-sip. The dog wasn't acting like he had found game. This was something else, a smell that got under the skin. Henry walked slowly over, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The ground beneath the old oak stump had softened over the years. Rot had hollowed out the base, and Copper's paws were pulling clumps of soil and old bark away from its center. It didn't take long. Maybe 5 minutes. Maybe a little more. Henry crouched beside the dog and saw the edge of something buried. Fabric. Faded, stained, rough like canvas. He brushed at it with the edge of a stick. When he tugged the item loose, it gave way too easily, like it had been waiting to be found. A soft thud against the forest floor. It was a bag. An old-style athletic bag. Navy blue, with cracked white lettering on the side. The kind people used to carry to basketball practice. Henry unzipped it, half expecting nothing. But what he saw made him draw a slow breath. Inside was a folded black robe. Not ordinary. This was ceremonial. There was also a Bible, wrapped in plastic, yellowed around the edges but dry. Henry turned it over. On the inside cover, written in ink now faded to brown, were the words, Reverend Isaiah Coleman. He stood up slowly, looked around the empty woods. The wind rustled the trees a little, but that was it. Then he pulled his phone from his coat pocket and dialed the sheriff's office. 2 hours later, David Coleman sat at the edge of his small couch, the TV remote resting in his hand but forgotten. The television played low in the background. Some preacher was giving a sermon in front of stained glass windows, his voice soft and steady, talking about endurance and faith. David wasn't listening. He had turned on the TV because the silence had become too much, but the sermon had hit a nerve he didn't expect. He hadn't been inside a church in more than 2 decades, not since he buried what little hope he had left. Faith had become a wound that never quite healed. And this morning, the wound was itching. The phone rang. It cut through the apartment like a knock on the soul. David didn't move right away. Then he stood, crossed to the kitchen, and answered. Mr. Coleman, this is Detective Marla Gaines with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. I apologize for the early call. We have found something this morning in the woods outside Willow Creek, and we believe it may be connected to your father's disappearance. David said nothing at first. The line held steady. Are you there, sir? I heard you, he replied, voice dry. What exactly did you find? An item buried near a tree stump. A local hunter and his dog uncovered a bag. Inside was a Bible and a ceremonial robe. The name Isaiah Coleman was written inside the Bible. We'd like you to come identify it. David leaned against the counter. His legs didn't quite trust him yet. I never expected that name to come back to me from anyone but family, he said. We understand. We can send an officer to bring you in, if that would help. He looked out the window. The trees were still. A crow sat on the railing, watching. Yeah, he said. All right, I'll be ready. He hung up, returned to the living room, and muted the TV. The preacher's mouth kept moving, but no sound came. David stared for a moment, then switched it off. The last time he had prayed was the day after his father vanished. He didn't remember the words. only the silence afterward. He had not stepped into a sanctuary since. Today, though, it seemed like the past was finally stepping out to find him. The forest clearing was quiet except for the occasional buzz of a cicada and the soft murmur of voices behind the yellow tape. David stood still just outside the perimeter, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes locked on the bag that had brought everything back. Detective Marla Gaines approached him from the left. She was in her early 50s, tall, steady-eyed, dressed in plain slacks and a navy field jacket. No small talk, just a nod. "Mr. Coleman," she said, stopping a few feet away, "thank you for coming. I know this must be a lot." David nodded once. His voice felt unused. "You said the bag had his name on it." Gaines motioned toward a folding table set up beneath a small canopy. "We laid it out here. I would like you to confirm what you recognize. We are handling it with gloves and care. Moisture damage is significant, but some parts are intact." David followed her silently. The ground beneath him was still soft from the morning's rain. Pine needles clung to his boots. Under the canopy, two crime scene technicians stood beside a worn-out canvas bag. It was faded, stained, and cracked in places, the once bright Adidas logo barely visible. One of the techs unzipped it and slowly removed the contents. First came the robe. It was a deep maroon liturgical robe, long-sleeved, lined at the collar, though the fabric had stiffened and turned brittle from decades underground. A patch of gold threading still clung to the left sleeve, the remains of a cross. David took a breath through his nose. "That's his," he said softly. "My father always wore that robe on first Sundays." The tech laid the robe carefully on a plastic sheet. Then came the Bible. It was swollen from moisture, the leather cover warped and the edges frayed. But it still held shape. The spine was cracked, and the pages stuck together in thick clumps. On the inside flap, in faded ink, was a name. Isaiah Coleman. David stepped closer. He didn't touch it, just leaned in. His father's handwriting was tight, upright, deliberate. Every letter printed clear and firm, like he was always speaking to someone through the page. "That's his writing," David said. His voice didn't shake, but it came out low. He always signed like that. Sharp pen, never cursive. Said it was clearer for people reading the word. Detective Gaines watched him, letting the silence breathe. The technician turned to the last item in the bag. It was a single sheet of paper, folded, thin and damp, but preserved between the Bible's middle pages. The corner had nearly dissolved. As it opened, a few words at the top were still legible. David leaned closer again. It was a handwritten note. "Lord," he read slowly, "give me strength to stand in your truth even when those closest to me fall into deception. Deliver your house from the hands of the proud." He paused. Beneath the prayer were 4 more lines, scribbled like a private confession. "They are drawing darkness around your altar. They speak in your name, but their hearts rot with greed. If I am not heard, may my silence still bear witness." David looked away. He took a few steps back and exhaled through his mouth, jaw clenched. "That sounds like a sermon," he said, quieter now. "But not for the pulpit." Detective Gaines nodded. "We are sending the contents to a forensic lab for preservation and analysis. But I wanted your eyes on it before anything left this site." She gave him space. No pressing questions. No presumptions. David glanced toward the trees, where the old oak stump still leaned. Half hollow now. The hole beneath it freshly dug, still damp from decades of shelter. "You said a dog found it," he murmured. "Yes," she said. "Local man walking his dog. The dog started digging, wouldn't stop. That's how we got here." David gave a tired half-smile. "Guess it's true what they say about dogs and bones." Then his face hardened again. "Why would my father bury this?" he asked, almost to himself. "And if he didn't, then who did? You don't carry your Bible and your robe into the woods just to disappear." "We are considering all possibilities," Gaines replied. "But the absence of a body, it complicates things. No blood on the robe. No signs of trauma yet. It could be someone hiding evidence. It could be symbolic. We don't know yet." David looked back at the bag. "I remember that robe. He used to hang it near the study, just before Sundays. He'd pray over it, hands trembling. That last year, he started locking his office at night. Never did that before." Gaines nodded again. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened?" David was quiet a long time. Then, he said, "Once, that even in the Lord's house, the devil takes a seat." She wrote nothing down. She just listened. "I need to know," he said finally. Not what people assumed. Not the rumors. Just truth. Whatever it is. You deserve that, Gaines said. And so did he. The sun was beginning to lower, shadows stretching across the clearing. The forensic team began sealing the items in labeled containers. David looked once more at the prayer note. The lines had grown darker in his memory already. They are drawing darkness around your altar. He turned away from the table and stepped back into the forest path, each footstep pressing into wet soil. Behind him, the canopy flapped in the wind. The old oak stump stood like a marker that had been waiting 3.5 decades to speak. And now, finally, it had. David parked at the curb in front of the brick duplex he had called home for the past 16 years. He sat in the driver's seat for a few moments longer than usual, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. A grocery bag with a half-eaten sandwich and a cold cup of coffee sat untouched on the passenger seat. He looked at neither. His keys jingled softly as he unlocked the door. The apartment inside was modest, clean, lived in but quiet. The kind of quiet that did not comfort. He kicked off his shoes and moved through the living room, past the worn armchair, the muted television still tuned to some daytime rerun he had forgotten to turn off. At the end of the hallway, behind a plain wooden door, was the room he rarely entered. He opened it. The study smelled of old paper and lemon oil. It had taken him months to recreate the space after he sold the family house and moved. He had packed and unpacked every item with care, but had never actually read through them. His father's desk sat near the window, positioned to catch the morning light. On the shelves were rows of black, cloth-bound notebooks. They were labeled with years, in his father's unmistakable handwriting. 72, 73, all the way up to 79. David reached up and ran his fingers along the spines. Each book was aligned with precision. When he pulled one down and opened it, the pages creaked slightly. Inside were sermon outlines, full passages in block lettering, margin notes in red ink, questions scribbled like reminders. His father had always prepared like a scholar and preached like a man who knew how little time people gave to listen. David kept moving through the notebooks. He reached the shelf that should have held the entries for 1980. There was a gap. His fingers paused at the empty space between 79 and 81. He checked the shelf below, then the small drawer of the filing cabinet. He even opened the cardboard boxes under the desk. Nothing. Back on his feet, he turned slowly, looking at the room again. Everything else was there. His father's Bible commentary volumes, worn at the edges. The green banker's lamp on the desk. A pencil holder still full, like someone might come back for it. But the notebook for 1980 was gone. So was the personal journal his father had started keeping the year his mother passed. David sat down in the office chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He leaned forward and rested his forearms on the desk. A long moment passed. Then he reached to the upper drawer. Inside were letters, bills, a funeral program, and a small envelope marked Mount Olive Cemetery plot. That church was long gone, absorbed into New Hope Baptist after the fire in '82. The old congregation had shifted. Most of them were gone now. Some moved away. Some buried. Some stayed and grew quiet. David tapped the envelope against the desk, then tucked it into his jacket. Later that night, he opened a box from the closet. Inside were cassette tapes, recordings of Sunday services from his father's last years. They were labeled neatly, month by month, though the last few were smudged from time and moisture. He slipped one into the tape deck and sat back. The hiss of the tape rolled in, followed by the low hum of a choir warming up. Then a voice came through. Familiar, warm, steady. This morning, I want to talk about what it means to speak light into a room that is determined to stay dark. David closed his eyes. The voice filled the small study. The tape continued, full of pauses, soft laughter from a distant congregation, and long silences where pages were turned. But the voice never wavered. His father had not sounded like a man preparing to disappear. He switched off the tape and stood up. The notebook for 1980 had been kept somewhere else. And there was only one other place where his father spent most of his time that year. The church. David grabbed his coat and keys again. The ride across town took less than 10 minutes. Willow Creek had not changed much. The storefronts on Main Street were still faded. The gas station still had one broken pump with a plastic bag over the nozzle. New Hope Baptist Church stood just beyond the cemetery, where a tall white steeple reached out above the pines. The parking lot was half full. The lights inside were dim, but on. He parked near the side entrance. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. It was nearly dusk. As he stood at the base of the church steps, David looked up at the building that had once been the center of his family's life. The bricks looked darker than he remembered. The paint on the handrails was peeling. He took a long breath and pushed open the side door. The hallway was silent. Linoleum underfoot. Faint sound of a vacuum somewhere down the hall. On the left was the office his father used to keep. He wondered who had the key now. He walked toward the sanctuary. The space opened before him like a memory drawn fresh. The pews were polished, lined in rows. The pulpit stood at the far end, still tall and clean. Behind it, the stained glass windows glowed faintly in the fading light. The same windows that had caught his father's face every Sunday. David sat in the last pew, second from the aisle. He did not pray, not yet, but he stayed, long enough to remember where he had come from, long enough to decide what he would do next. The doors to New Hope Baptist Church opened with the same slow creak David remembered from his childhood. The sound echoed faintly through the empty narthex, where the scent of old varnish and candle wax still lingered. A narrow strip of sunlight poured through a tall window and fell across the linoleum floor. The place was clean but tired, like someone had done just enough to keep the building standing, but not enough to keep it alive. He paused at the edge of the hallway and looked toward the main office. The wooden door still had the small brass plate that read Senior Pastor. His father's name used to be there once. Now it read Reverend Amos Tate. A woman in a gray cardigan came out of the supply room and caught sight of him. "Can I help you?" she asked, cautious but kind. "I'm looking for Reverend Tate," David replied. "And Deacon Shaw, if he's here." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "They're both in the fellowship room, just down the hall. Would you like me to tell them someone's here?" "No," David said. "I'll go." The hallway was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The fellowship room sat at the end, its door partly open. As he approached, he heard voices, low and steady. He knocked once. Amos Tate looked up first. He was in his 60s now, thinner than David remembered, with silver in his beard and sharp creases around his eyes. Across from him sat Luther Shaw, still broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Well," Amos said slowly, "I'll be David Coleman." David nodded. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Amos said, standing. "Come on in." Luther offered a nod, but said nothing. David stepped into the room and glanced around. It had not changed much. Folding chairs, bulletin boards, a coffee pot that looked like it had been there since the 70s. "I was at the sanctuary earlier," David began. "Sat for a bit. Thought about how long it's been." "You're welcome here anytime," Amos said, easing back into his seat. "We've missed your father's voice more than you know." David hesitated. "That's part of why I came." Amos's expression didn't shift, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I've been going through his things," David continued. "Notebooks, sermon notes, personal writings. Everything's there. Every year up to 1979. Then nothing. The year he disappeared is missing." Luther finally spoke. "Could have been lost when the church burned in '82. We lost a lot of records. These were in his personal collection," David said. "Not church property." Amos tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "I remember your father kept duplicates sometimes. Maybe he left something here. What are you hoping to find?" "I don't know," David said. "But something doesn't sit right. You worked with him. You would know if he started acting different. If he mentioned anything off." There was a pause. "He was tired," Amos said at last, "carrying more than most of us could see. But he never said anything directly. And nothing about the missing notebook?" David pressed. Luther crossed his arms. "David, it's been 35 years. Memories fade." David nodded slowly. "Would you mind if I looked around the library? Just in case." Amos glanced at Luther, then back at David. "Of course. I'll come with you." The church library was just across from the old education wing. It had the same scuffed tile floors and tall wooden shelves filled with hymnals, old commentaries, and binders of Sunday school materials. The air was dry, heavy with dust, and quiet. They stepped inside. David moved to the shelf marked Sermon Archives and began scanning the rows. Some binders were labeled with years, others with sermon themes. Nothing seemed out of place. Amos stood near the back, flipping through a box labeled Financial Reports. Luther hovered near the door. David opened a cabinet drawer filled with loose papers, meeting notes, and old correspondence. He moved slowly, careful not to scatter anything, but inside he found only a few faded printouts from the early 90s. After a while, Amos cleared his throat. "Looks like your search came up empty." David did not respond. He stood still, then walked toward a reading table near the window. There, he sat and pulled from his bag the last notebook he had brought from home. It was marked 1979, the final year before the missing one. He opened it and flipped through the pages. His father's notes were as precise as ever. Sermon titles, biblical references, handwritten outlines. At the back of the notebook, tucked in the sleeve, was a single page with verses about truth and accountability. Isaiah had underlined a passage from Matthew. It was the kind of note David remembered his father reviewing before difficult sermons. "Mind if I leave this here for a while?" David asked. Amos looked up. "You planning to come back?" "Yes," David said. "I think I will." He stood, careful to place the notebook gently on the table. Amos nodded once. "You're welcome anytime." As David walked out, Luther followed him to the hallway. "You still think something happened?" Luther said, voice low. "I think something's missing," David replied. "And I'd like to know why." Luther didn't answer. David left through the side door and walked toward his car. He did not notice that behind him, through the narrow library window, the notebook still lay open, its final page marked by his father's steady handwriting and the faint indent of something once pressed hard against the paper. And he did not yet realize he had left it behind. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften as David pulled into the gravel lot across from Willow Creek Cemetery. The iron gate was unlocked, the kind of small-town detail no one really questioned. He parked beneath an oak tree and stepped out, brushing dust from his jacket as he crossed the narrow street. The cemetery was still. The air smelled faintly of grass and honeysuckle. Wind moved gently through the trees, stirring the faded plastic flowers that leaned against certain stones. David walked the familiar path, passing the marker where his mother's name was etched. Sarah Coleman, beloved wife and mother. He slowed, touched the edge of the stone briefly with his hand, then kept walking. A soft sound stopped him. It was not wind. It was crying. He turned toward the far side of the cemetery, near the older graves. There, half hidden beneath the wide shadow of a cedar tree, sat a boy. He looked small, no more than 9 or 10. His clothes were too thin for the chill in the air. His back leaned against a trunk, knees pulled up close, head resting in the crook of one arm. David approached slowly. "Hey," he said gently. "You all right out here?" The boy did not answer at first. Then he raised his head. His eyes were red. His face looked pale and slightly sunken. David knelt down a few feet away. "My name's David," he said. "You got a name?" The boy sniffed and wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Eli," he mumbled. "Eli," David repeated softly. "You here with someone?" The boy hesitated, then nodded toward a grave nearby. David followed his gaze. The stone was modest. It read Marion Townsend, 1952 to 2012. Beloved mother. David exhaled slowly. "Is someone picking you up?" "No," Eli said. "I was at my aunt's house. I left." "Why?" "She says I cry too much." David nodded quietly. There was a long pause. "You look cold," David said finally. "I'm okay." "You sick?" Eli hesitated again, then gave a small nod. "My chest hurts. I get sick a lot. My mom used to. She used to pray over me. At church. But she's gone now." David looked at him carefully. "You from around here?" Eli nodded. "New Hope Baptist still your church?" The boy looked up. It was hers. "We stopped going after she died. My aunt says God does not pay the bills." David tried not to smile. The answer was too honest. "Did she ever take communion home for you?" he asked. Eli's eyes lit up a little. "Yeah, when I had fevers. She'd bring it home in a little cloth thing. She'd break the bread and say the words real soft. Said it helped more than medicine sometimes." David felt a pressure in his chest that was not quite pain. "She believed in it," Eli said. "She did," David replied. There was another silence. "Do you want to go home?" David asked. The boy shook his head. "Well, I can't leave you out here," David said. "And I don't think your mother would want that either." Eli looked at him, something cautious and open in his eyes. "You believe in God?" the boy asked. David took a moment. "I used to. Then I didn't. Now, I don't know." "That's okay," Eli said. "You seem nice anyway." David smiled just a little. "Would you take communion with me?" Eli asked. "Like my mom did. I don't have to be in church, right?" David looked at the boy, sitting there in the fading light, thin and pale and alone. He thought about the robe buried in the woods, the prayer note, his father's empty study, the book he had left behind. "I would," David said, "but I need to go get it first. Wait here. I'll come back." Eli nodded. David stood and turned toward the gate. The sun was lower now, casting longer shadows. The wind had grown cooler. As he walked back to his car, he reached for his keys and paused. Something tightened in his gut. He opened the door and sat behind the wheel, but he did not start the engine right away. He leaned forward and opened the passenger seat. The notebook, the one from 1979. It was not there. David's breath caught. He closed his eyes and tried to retrace the moment. The church library, the reading table by the window. He had set it down, opened it, looked through the last page, then walked out. He had not picked it back up. He sat in silence for a few seconds, feeling a dull weight behind his ribs. He started the engine. He would go back to the church, then return to Eli with the communion. The boy had asked for something simple, a moment of faith. David could not explain it, but somehow it felt tied to everything. The years, the silence, the robe in the woods, the prayer in the Bible, a boy in a cemetery asking for bread and grape juice, and something steady to hold on to. He pulled onto the road as the first stars began to show in the sky. The church was mostly dark when David returned. Only a faint glow came from one of the hallway lights near the education wing. He tried the side door and found it unlocked. The metal handle was cold against his palm as he pushed it open and stepped inside. His shoes made soft clicks on the linoleum floor. He did not call out. The building seemed quieter at night. Or maybe it just felt that way because of what he was carrying inside him now. There was a strange tension beneath the surface, a weight that had not been there when he left. He passed the kitchen and turned down the hall toward the library. The door was closed now. Earlier, it had been left open. He hesitated, then turned the knob slowly and stepped inside. The overhead lights were off, but a dim table lamp near the back gave the room a warm, amber glow. Someone had tidied up. The boxes had been pushed neatly under shelves. The cabinet doors were shut. The sermon archive shelf looked undisturbed, and his father's notebook was right where he had left it. Open. David crossed the room and picked it up carefully. The page he had left open had been turned slightly. He looked at it, trying to tell whether someone had flipped through it, but he could not be sure. The pages were fragile, and the air had a way of shifting things. He slid the notebook into his bag. Then he noticed the book. It was sitting on the top shelf of the finance section, a thin, hardback volume with a blue spine, the kind of church manual that most pastors read once and shelved for decades. It was tilted slightly forward, not flush with the others. He reached up and pulled it down. The title read Church Financial Management and Stewardship. David held it in both hands and flipped to the inside cover. A stamp from the Willow Creek Association dated it back to the late 1970s. He opened to the middle. Someone had underlined several passages in blue pen. One paragraph talked about the sacred nature of church funds. Another described the importance of clear accountability in small congregations. Then he saw the handwriting. In the margin beside a section on pastoral ethics, someone had written, in the familiar print he could not mistake, "God sees how we handle what belongs to him." David stared at the words. His father had written them in the same deliberate, straight-letter style he always used when teaching. The ink had faded slightly, but the pressure of the pen was still visible, pressing deep into the page. He kept flipping. Another page. More notes. Then something odd. 2 names, written faintly in pencil, had been circled and then erased. David tilted the book under the light, angling it until the indentations caught a shadow. He could read them, just barely. Amos Tate, Luther Shaw, each name followed by a question mark. He went still. The room felt colder. He flipped a few more pages. More underlined text. Phrases about oversight, temptation, the weight of leadership. In one spot, a verse from Proverbs had been scribbled in the margin. Beside it, the same small block letters. Private sin eventually becomes public shame. David closed the book slowly. His mind was not racing. It was moving very carefully. There had always been something about the way Amos had answered his questions. Measured, too clean. And Luther, silent when silence made things heavier, not lighter. Still, none of it proved anything. He stood at the center of the room, holding both books now, one in each hand. His father's sermons and this overlooked financial manual that someone had tucked away decades ago. There were no alarms, no flashing signs, Just quiet pages and quiet marks left by a man who had disappeared without ever raising his voice. David walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned back and looked at the shelf. Someone had tried to erase those names. Someone had thought the page was buried, but it had waited, and tonight it had been found again. The cemetery looked different at night. The shadows were longer, the edges less defined. Even the headstones seemed to lean in a little closer under the moonlight. David parked his car off the shoulder, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with the lights off. The radio dial still glowed faintly. A gospel station, static in the background. He turned the knob until the hum disappeared. The notebook and the financial book sat on the passenger seat. He had not told anyone yet, not even Detective Gaines. Instead, something had pulled him back to this place. Not instinct exactly, just a sense that something was still in motion, something unfinished. He opened the door carefully. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he stepped out. He walked along the edge of the road, keeping to the trees. The cemetery gates were open again. The town never really locked them. He slipped inside. At first, everything was still. Then, movement. Two figures near the far end, just past the older headstones. They were using shovels. David stepped behind a maple tree and watched. One of the men had a flashlight strapped to his head. The other held a black trash bag open beside a shallow pit. David recognized both of them even in the dark. Amos Tate, Luther Shaw. They were digging. He moved closer, staying low, circling along the stone wall that lined the east side of the property. A breeze moved the branches, covering the sound of his steps. From this angle, he could hear them talking, though not every word. Amos said something about timing. Luther muttered something about hurrying. Their voices were clipped, strained, the kind of tone that came from urgency and fear. David took one more step forward, and something cracked under his foot. They froze. "Who's there?" Amos called out. David stood up. "It's me," he said. "David." The flashlight beam turned, catching him in the chest. "What are you doing out here?" Amos asked, his voice tight. "I could ask the same," David replied. Luther set the bag down and stepped back. "We were just moving something," Amos said. "In the middle of the night?" David asked. "No heads up to the church? No records?" "It's not a big deal," Amos said. "This spot was originally marked for a pet burial. The family asked us to relocate it. They want to use the plot for another loved one." David looked at the hole, then at the bag. "That bag looks heavier than it should be," he said. Amos opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Luther shifted his weight. "You following us, David?" "No," David said. "I came back for something, but I guess I found something else." The silence stretched. David walked forward slowly, not getting too close. "You ever wonder," he said, "what else might be buried around here? I mean, for all the talk about the old days, this cemetery holds a lot of silence." Amos's jaw tensed. "You're pushing something that has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," David said. "My father disappeared. This church buried him in memory, but never on paper. And now I find two church leaders out here at night, digging a hole where no one's supposed to be digging." Luther looked away. David looked down at the dirt. The soil was loose, freshly turned. He noticed a small piece of fabric near the edge. It looked like an old canvas scrap. Amos stepped between him and the hole. "That's enough," he said. "You don't know what you're suggesting." David's voice stayed calm. "I don't. But I know what I saw earlier in that book. Two names, circled, then erased. And I know my father's handwriting." Luther looked at Amos. "We should go." "We will," Amos said, but his eyes stayed on David. "You need to be careful. Sometimes digging too deep brings up things best left alone." David held his gaze. "And sometimes the truth only shows up after everything else rots away." No one spoke after that. Amos and Luther packed the bag into the trunk of a sedan parked near the back fence. They drove off without another word. David stood there a long moment after their taillights vanished. He looked back at the disturbed soil. He pulled out his phone, but did not dial. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back into the trees. The cold air settled around him, but he was not going anywhere. Not until he understood why men who once preached about light were so afraid of being seen in the dark. David sat in his car just down the road from the cemetery, headlights off, engine running. He watched as the sedan carrying Amos and Luther rolled past him slowly, then turned toward the state highway. Luther was behind the wheel. David pulled out behind them. He did not tail them too close. 2 or 3 car lengths. Enough to stay invisible, not enough to lose sight. The road was mostly empty this time of night. The town was asleep, and whatever they were doing, they clearly did not expect company. The car continued through town, past the fire station, then veered onto the narrow road that led toward the foothills. David frowned. There was nothing out that way, just forest, abandoned cabins, and gravel roads that turned to mud when it rained. He picked up his phone and tapped in the number for Detective Gaines. She answered on the second ring. "Gaines," she said, clipped and alert. "It's David Coleman," he said. "I'm following Luther Shaw's car. He is with Amos. They just left the cemetery." "Where are they headed?" "Mountain View Road. Headed into the hills." There was a pause. "What makes you think this is connected?" David gripped the wheel tighter. "Because they were digging something up in the cemetery with a black bag," he said. "Because Amos got nervous when he saw me. Because whatever is in that trunk, they are not supposed to have it." "Are you following directly?" "At a safe distance," David said. "I just need you to send someone." "We are dispatching a unit," Gaines said. "Do not engage. Just keep us updated." "I understand," he said. The line clicked off. David turned off the radio and followed the glow of their tail lights as the road narrowed. He kept one hand near the bright switch. The trees crowded in on both sides. The asphalt ended and became a rough gravel path. His tires kicked up dust and small stones. Up ahead, the sedan came to a slow stop. David eased his car off the road and parked behind a line of pine trees. He watched. Luther got out of the driver's seat. He opened the trunk and pulled the bag out again. Amos stood by the edge of the overlook, looking down toward the valley below. David opened his door and stepped into the night. The air was crisp, colder up here. He moved quietly, staying behind the trees. The overlook had a wooden guardrail, and a narrow path led down to a lower platform just above the drop-off. Luther began walking that direction with the bag over his shoulder. David followed. He stayed back, just out of view, until he saw the glint of Luther's headlamp bouncing off the trail. When Luther reached the lower platform, he set the bag down and began to untie it. David stepped forward. "Luther." The older man froze. He did not turn. David walked closer, staying on the trail. "You planning to throw that over?" he asked. Luther slowly turned, his face pale under the light. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "That's what everyone keeps saying," David replied. Luther's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what this is," he said. "I know it is something you are trying to erase," David said. "And I have a feeling it has been buried for a long time." Luther looked down at the bag, then back at David. "He was going to destroy us," he said. "Everything we built. He would not stop." "You mean my father?" David said. Luther flinched. David took a slow step forward. "I want to see what is in the bag," he said. Luther shook his head. "It's too late." David took another step. "You already dug it up. Might as well let me see it before you send it off the edge." Luther stared at him, breathing heavy. From above, the distant sound of sirens began to echo through the hills. David said nothing. Luther looked down at the bag, then back up the trail. He hesitated, then backed away from it. David stepped forward and knelt. Inside the bag was a collection of items wrapped in old cloth. He pulled one layer back and saw a leather-bound notebook and a second book beneath it. A familiar spine, a personal journal, and what looked like a robe, folded but stained. He looked up at Luther. "You kept this," David said. "All these years." Luther said nothing. The sirens grew louder. David stood. "You are going to answer for this," he said. Luther stared at the ground. As the flashing lights lit up the treetops, David stepped back and waited. Whatever this was, it had come to the surface now. And this time, he was not going to look away. The conference room in the county sheriff's office was cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. David sat across from Detective Gaines, hands resting on a thin stack of files. The air smelled faintly of coffee and photocopier toner. On the table between them was the leather-bound notebook and the missing 1980 sermon journal. Next to those sat a sealed plastic evidence bag. Inside was a worn cross pendant and the embroidered name tag that once adorned his father's preaching robe. David had not said much. He had come in early and waited. When Gaines finally entered with a printout in her hand, she slid it toward him without a word. He read it. DNA results. Confirmed. The remains buried under the kennel lot. They were his father's. He let out a slow breath and folded the page carefully. "He's been there this whole time," he said quietly. Gaines nodded. The dental records were a partial match, but the DNA settled it. David looked up at her. "And the confession?" he asked. She tapped a digital recorder and hit play. Luther Shaw's voice came through. Low, gravelly, like it had taken him years to build up the strength to speak these words. He came to me with papers, Luther said on the recording. Ledgers, notes from the finance office. Names, numbers. Isaiah said we had to tell the truth, that the congregation deserved to know. There was a pause, then more. He said if we didn't come clean, he would take it to the church board himself. Said he already sent a letter to the bishop's office. I told Amos. We both knew what would happen if that got out. David stared at the recorder. He confronted us that night. I don't remember all of it. Just the shouting. The way Amos grabbed the tire iron. The sound it made. Gaines stopped the tape. That's enough for now, she said. David nodded. He sat back in his chair. There was no satisfaction in it. Just stillness. A silence that felt heavier now that the truth had arrived. Later that afternoon, they returned to the woods. The same pine trees. The same path. Only now, it was marked with yellow tape and uniformed officers. The canine unit had returned to sweep the wider area. It did not take long. Under the roots of a dead oak tree, just 50 yards from the cemetery, they found the second cache. More evidence. Robes. Notes. Financial records wrapped in oilcloth. The officers carefully documented everything. David stood near the tree, watching as they unearthed each piece. Gaines joined him. He was meticulous, she said. He separated the evidence from his own body, as if he knew someone would find one, but not both. David nodded slowly. He was always like that, he said. Precise. He planned his sermons 3 months ahead. Even wrote his prayers in pencil first. They stood in silence for a moment. The wind moved through the trees. Gaines turned toward him. You did good, she said. You didn't give up. David looked down at the spot where the old tree had fallen. I almost did, he said. But something about that bag. About Copper finding it. It felt like he was still reaching out. Gaines did not reply. She just placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Back at the house, David sat at the kitchen table. He laid the journal flat and opened to the page marked with a blue ribbon. The handwriting was clean. Familiar. March 18th, 1980. Tonight, I saw the storm coming. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of men I thought I knew. I fear what will happen if I speak, but I fear more what will happen if I don't. Lord, if you take me soon, let my son know I tried. David closed the journal. He sat for a long time. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting gold across the floor. He felt the ache of something that had lived too long without a name. But now it had one. Truth. And though it came too late for some, it had finally arrived. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of a nearby oxygen machine. Outside the window, dusk settled gently over the rooftops, casting long shadows that touched the pale linoleum floor. David sat in the chair beside Eli's bed, the small boy's frame nestled under a quilt his aunt had brought in earlier that morning. The child's breathing was steady but shallow. Eli's aunt, Marlene, stood near the door, watching. She had said very little since David arrived, offering only a small nod and a whispered thank you before stepping back. David had not worn anything special. No collar, no robe, just a clean shirt, his father's old Bible, and a small wooden cross that felt heavier in his pocket than it looked. He had not led a service in over 30 years, had not spoken a formal prayer aloud in public since he buried his mother. But something in Eli's eyes reminded him of those Sunday mornings long ago, when the light hit the stained glass just right and his father's voice would carry steady and sure, even when the pews were nearly empty. David cleared his throat and opened the Bible. The pages were thin, edges curled slightly from years of turning. He read quietly, the words half to himself, half to the still room. This is my body, broken for you. Eli's eyelids fluttered. His lips moved. David smiled, only slightly. He had no wafers, no silver chalice, just a small cracker broken in two and a cup of grape juice from the vending machine in the hallway. He dipped the cracker gently and held it to the boy's lips. Eli took it slowly. His hand reached out and found David's. For a moment, neither moved. Then the boy whispered, "Mama used to do that when I was sick." David nodded. She remembered what mattered. He turned to Marlene. "Would you like to join?" She hesitated, then stepped forward. He offered the second piece. Her hands trembled, but she accepted it. They sat together in silence. 3 souls in a quiet room, joined not by doctrine but by presence. After a while, David closed the Bible and placed it gently on the bedside table. He spoke, not as a preacher, but as a man who had wandered too long without peace. "I spent 35 years being angry at God," he said, "for what happened to my father, for not answering, for not stopping it." He looked at the boy, then at the cross on the wall above the bed. "But maybe God does not stop the storm. Maybe he sits beside us through it." Marlene's eyes filled with quiet tears. David stood. The hallway outside was filled with the soft shuffle of nurses, the distant sound of a lullaby from the intercom. He stepped out into the fading light. Something in his chest loosened. He was not a pastor. He was not seeking a pulpit. But in that room, with that child, he had remembered who he was. Not because of what he lost, but because of what remained. Love. And that, he thought, might just be enough. The walk from the hospital was slow. David took the long way home, passing the corner where his father once gave out food during the winter storm of '79. The same street lamp still stood there, a little rusted now, flickering faintly in the evening mist. He paused in front of the old community bulletin board near the church fence. A new flyer had been posted. Youth choir rehearsal this Sunday. Underneath it, someone had pinned a yellowing photo of Isaiah Coleman, smiling with his arms around a younger David. A quiet memorial. No ceremony, just presence. He reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the tacks holding it in place. For a long time he had wanted answers, wanted justice, wanted someone to blame. And now, having held both the truth and the evidence in his own hands, he realized it was not the final word he needed. It was permission to move forward. A light breeze stirred the trees above. At the parsonage, the porch light had been replaced. Warm yellow shone through the windows. Inside, he found the floorboards just as they had been, with that one creaky step by the kitchen. He sat at the table and opened his father's journal again, not to search, not to investigate, but to listen. A small envelope fell from the back cover. Inside was a card, handwritten in Isaiah's script. "David," it read, "if you are reading this, it means you came back." He paused, breath caught. "I pray you have not come in anger. I pray instead that you have come to heal. The truth is not meant to end our lives. It is meant to restart them." Tears came softly, without sound. He did not wipe them away. That Sunday, he returned to New Hope, not as a leader, not as a son trying to restore a name, but simply as a man holding a quiet peace. Eli sat in the front pew, color back in his cheeks. Marlene nodded to him from the aisle. No sermon was preached, no announcement made. David took his seat near the back, and when the choir rose, singing an old hymn about light and return, he closed his eyes, not in grief, not in mourning, but in thanks. Because even after all those years in shadow, the door had opened again, and what stepped through was not vengeance, but grace. What do you think about the choice David made in the end? Would you have done something different if it had been you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I do read every single one. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something quietly deep, go ahead and leave a like. Share it with someone you believe needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next quiet mystery waiting to be uncovered. I'll see you in the next story. And who knows, maybe next time, it'll be your voice that brings a buried truth back into the light.